Welcome back. I'm Bill. Today I have a Coleman 220 with me. 220s are very common along with their siblings, the 228. 220s and 228s are identical except for the 228's wider brim. It's porcelain wide underneath so that it's more reflective, and of course it's got a wider bail to accommodate the wider vent, but they're identical otherwise. Coleman made these for a very long time. They were a very popular lantern, particularly in the US. The Wichita factory introduced them to the US market in 1928, and they went through various incarnations, which is what the D comes from. This is the D incarnation. They went from the original, which was actually called the L220 or the L228. Sometimes you'll hear those referred to as the slant because the generator sits at an angle. It's got a somewhat different valve design than the later ones. The Wichita factory then skipped A and went from B all the way through K in 1983 when they discontinued production. The Toronto factory made fewer of these, and they also had the original slant versions, and then they introduced an A variant, which is, if you see one, very desirable and rare, and then the B. And in 1941, the Toronto factory stopped making the 220 and 228B, and the 220, not the 228, but the 220 was reintroduced by Toronto in 1962. The later ones are fairly different from the American versions. The 220E in Canada was red, for example. The E in the US was green, and they had a somewhat different vent design. But the functionality of it, the valves, all the parts are for the most part interchangeable and nearly identical. So the D variant, both of these are Ds. This is a 228D, this is a 220D. They were made between 1947 and 1951 in the Wichita factory. So this is stamped A50, this is stamped B49. So in the 1940s, off and on at various times, they did things a little bit differently. The A and the B represent the month, and rather than doing what they would normally do and stamping a single or double digit stamp corresponding to the month, like 3 for March or 10 for October, at some points in the 40s, they would stamp simply in Wichita A or B for the first half of the year or the second half of the year. In the Toronto factory, they would do A, B, C, or D for the quarter. So A being the first quarter, D being the last quarter. And it's a little bit confusing because sometimes on some models, I don't think you'll find it on these, but on some of them, you'll find that in the same time period, some are marked with an A or a B or a C or a D, and others actually have the month stamped. So I don't know if maybe they had different sets of dies at different stamping stations, or a different guy was working the stamping station on that day, and he did something differently than the guy the day before or the week before. So this was made in the first half of 1950. This was made in the second half of 1949. Ds have some variety. You'll find some that have green painted founts. The early green painted founts will also have a yellow decal on them with instructions, similar to 220BX or a C, but the wording is somewhat different. But then you'll find, like in 1951, they made some with green painted founts, but there's no instruction decal. But most of the Ds you'll find have nickel founts like these. They're brass, but it's got nickel plating over the top. So that's kind of the D story in the bigger 220 story. This is in nice shape. I've already fired it up, although one of the mantles is missing. This came recently from an old college friend of mine down in Portland. I met up with her recently, and this belonged to her dad. And she thought this should go into my collection, and she wanted to see it cleaned up. So thank you, Allison. Here it is. We'll start cleaning this up in a second. This is all pretty much all original. It's even got the original Coleman Green Sunshine logo glass. The only thing on here that's not original is the fuel cap. This would have originally had a three-piece cap like this, and I know maybe I should leave this on here just so it's original to how I got it, and that's part of the story, but I'll probably put this three-piece cap on here just to make it all original. We'll see at the end. I'll have to make up my mind between now and then. But other than that, this is all original, and the nickel looks pretty darn good, so I think it'll clean up pretty nicely. So I'm going to make some adjustments to the camera, and we'll start tearing into this thing. We begin with the vent. Happy to see this looks like it has the original vent nut to it. Oftentimes these have been replaced. Put that in my parts box here. Take the vent off. The vent looks like it'll clean up really nicely. It's almost mint. It's got one little chip here, so a little wear spot here, but this will be beautiful. And the globe, you might see, we've got hopefully the camera can focus on that. We've got the Coleman Green Sunshine logo on the front and the Pyrex made in USA on the back. So this is the original globe that came on this. Let's get rid of this mantle that fell off. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this other one too. And where do we go from here? Well, let's start with the generator. 7/16 wrench on here. Let's see if that'll come off easily. Yep. Like I said, I did fire this up. The one mantle burned really nicely. We just had flame coming out of the other side. So I'm going to lift the generator up. The cleaning rod is in here. So I'll rotate the tip cleaner actuator, this eccentric block up, unhook it, and then we'll just drop the whole thing down. So I know this works. Our cleaning needle is still on there. That's great. We'll be careful about that. The nut off. Take the tip off. We'll clean that with all the brass parts, and let's see if we can get the guts out of here. I'm going to have to heat and quench this to get this apart. So the generator rebuild video, like I said, this generator works fine. I could clean the carbon off of it and put it back in. It would be all right. But I like to have these things really clean. This is going to have an asbestos braid inside of it, and then there's a spring inside of that, and that keeps that cleaning needle centered. And it's going to be all coked up inside there. Not too badly, so hopefully it won't take too much to get it out, but I'm going to have to heat and quench that. I'm not going to show you that part because I've got a whole video on that, and I'll put a link up above. All right, so now the next thing we want to do is remove the tip cleaning assembly. So leave this nut alone. The packing, there's a graphite packing inside there. There's not much you can do with that. So we're going to leave that alone. And we're going to turn this part and take off the tip cleaner. This has a little wire on it with an L in it, and it interfaces with this eccentric block. And you might be able to see here as I turn this, see the eccentric block goes up and down. It's still engaged, but as we back it out, it should disengage. Doesn't quite want to come out. There we go. And we'll just take that out. You see there's this cutout here for this. If we don't take this out, then it gets in the way of moving around the frame or the burner cage. These aren't really serviceable. I'm going to clean it up. If it leaks out of here, the graphite packing is leaking, you can tighten it up a little bit and see if that helps. But generally speaking, on these 220 tip cleaner assemblies, there's not much you can do with it other than just clean it up. If you try to take it apart, you'll probably end up damaging it, and it's not worth the trouble. Thankfully, they're readily available, so if you do break it, that's not a problem. But there really isn't anything serviceable in here, so we're just going to leave this as it is and set it aside. Now, I want to take off this burner assembly. it's threaded down here on the end, and it threads into the back of the valve. And there's a screw here, like a set screw, sort of, that holds it in place. And you'll notice it ends up sitting down at a bit of an angle. So make sure the screwdriver you use on this gets a good bite on it. And usually they're brass, the screw is brass, and the back of the valve there is brass, so they don't typically get stuck. But if they do, just use a propane torch and a little bit of heat, or before you ever take the thing apart, you could put some penetrating oil here and in the threads here, which will facilitate getting the whole thing apart. But usually this part comes apart pretty easily. Just make sure you've got a good bite on it with a screwdriver that's the right size, so you don't strip it out because of the angle. Now once that's out, this whole thing, in theory, should turn. Again, it's brass on brass, so it shouldn't be too stuck. And that's not where the flame is, so it's not going through any major expansion and contraction cycles. So typically they come out fairly easily. Now, let's set this aside. When we're servicing these, one of the things we need to do is to take these burner caps off, and we want to, if we can, take the air tube off. The vent stud can come out, but it's not worth the trouble, and there's a good chance you'll end up damaging something in the process. But we would like to get these 3 tubes off, or at least the burner tubes, because now on this I know there's nothing in there because I've actually had it running. But if you haven't, critters like to get up in here. Mud daubers will get up there. They'll build nests. Spiders will get up there and build webs. I actually found a wasp inside one time that had crawled down and died at the burner cap. And so you want to try to get these off so that you can get something in there and clean it out and make sure that it's clean. Now, oftentimes this will require heating and quenching to break these joints loose, but we'll see if we can get this. I've got some pliers with some electrical tape wrapped on them to keep from chewing things up. Try grabbing the burner caps. If you grab the burner tube, these are brass, they're soft. If nothing else, you'll put teeth marks on there. But it's really common on these lanterns. If someone else has messed with it before, you will find the burner tubes are crushed or they're out of round because someone put the pliers on there and crushed it. Now, you could also take the burner caps off. One thing to do at this point is inspect the screen. That screen needs to be intact. If it's got minor damage, that's all right, but it needs to be 90-95% intact, or the flame won't be dispersed right when it comes to the mantle. So these are fine. I'm going to leave these as they are. I can get in there and get all this clean, get the carbon out. This is good enough. But if your burner screen is damaged, you'll need to take this apart. And if it doesn't come apart easily, if you're going to end up squashing the tube, then take a propane torch and a glass or a container of ice water and heat this until it's red. Quench it in the water. Do that several times until it loosens up. But like I said, you really only need to do that if the burner screen is damaged. So these are coming apart pretty easily. They don't always do that. And our burner screen here is good. So now this is more problematic. Again, this has a screw that locks. It's got a hole here, it's got a hole at the top, and it's threaded into the manifold. And this screw makes sure that it doesn't turn. This screw is often, if it doesn't want to turn, it doesn't want to turn. So because I can get a brush all the way up here, I'm going to leave it alone. It doesn't need to come off. I can clean everything in here. I can polish all of this without taking it out. This screw, the head will snap off very easily. Again, if you want to be really OCD about these things, heat and quench it, heat and quench it, heat and quench it, and oftentimes that screw will pop loose. But because I can get everything clean the way it is, and I already know there's nothing obstructing it, I'm just going to leave it there. Okay, now back to this. First thing we want to do is, reach in all the way, we want to take out our eccentric block. This is just loosen the valve. I'll show you a trick for getting it installed later. Don't lose that. And also, if it doesn't come out easily, you can try to grab it with some needle nose pliers and pull it out, but this is really dirty right now, so you can't tell, but this is brass. It's soft. This top part is thin. This part is thin. If you try to wrench on it to pull it out of there, you can very easily break it. Ask me how I know. So if it doesn't want to come out, just leave it for now. If it doesn't want to come out the whole time, that's okay. Just leave it. It'll be fine. But usually they'll fall out when you turn the lantern over. So make sure you take that out now and put it in the container with your other parts so you don't lose it. Now, here's the fun part on a 220. We need to get this upper part of the valve out. 220s are a little more complicated than other models because they've got this two-part valve. This is sort of the upper tip cleaner part, and the generator mounts on here and the air tube mounts in there. The valve is down here and is screwed into the fount. So this just unscrews. But it's not quite that simple, because you need to look at this and say, how am I going to unscrew that? Because let's just say, let's put a wrench on here. That's not there. I'll just use a crescent wrench so you can see. Let's put a wrench on here and twist. Guess what you're going to do? You're going to put pressure this way. You're going to crush the side of this. And then, when you go to put your tip cleaner back in, guess what? It won't thread back in. Now, good news is, these parts are easy to find and they're not very expensive, but you're going to have to get a new one, and your lantern won't be original anymore. A better option would be to take a big crescent wrench and put it on the back here and turn things. Now, that's less likely to be a problem, but you could still, I've never had it happen, and I have done that before, but you could end up crushing the side of this. And again, then your air tube won't screw back in. So here's what you want to do. First, I think this is a 9/16, yeah. This nut down below is what secures the burner cage. So we're just going to loosen that up a bit, and that will allow the burner cage to rotate here. And then we will take a 1/2 inch, where's my 1/2 inch? Okay, so you'll take your 1/2 inch wrench and you'll put it over the valve body like this. Well, it should be a 1/2 inch. At least sometimes the castings have some variations in them. Let's try a 9/16. It'll probably be a little bit sloppy, but it should work just fine. Yeah, that'll be all right. So we'll use a 9/16, and we'll put it over the valve. Now, if you've got a longer one, it really doesn't make a difference, but a longer one that sticks up above the frame here may make things a little bit easier, but because I've loosened that nut, the burner cage will simply turn with my screwdriver. So now, all we do, hold tight and we twist. Try it with a different hand, or we may. I think we're just going to have to lay it on its side like this. Get this out of the way. Oh, that's really tight. There we go. And now we can turn that off. take this nut off there so we can get everything cleaned up. Put those with our parts, and we'll take the burner cage off. This burner cage is in really nice shape. I mean, it's sooty. Apparently at some point someone flooded it and had a fire underneath there, but that's okay, that'll clean off easily. Usually they're rusty down in here, and this is not. So take the collar off. There we go. Orient it right and everything comes off easily. This one's marked 220, model 220D, and the Coleman logo. Some earlier ones are not. So just because it's not marked 220D doesn't mean it's not. We'll set that aside. And let's quickly, before we mess with the valve, because that's going to be a bit of a chore, let's take the fuel cap off. I have already drained the fuel out of this. Just always a good idea before you work on these, especially if you need to use any kind of fire on these, like a propane torch. That shouldn't be an issue, but you want to make sure the fount is empty and dry. You might rinse it with some alcohol just to make sure, and then let it sit for a while. On a D, these pump caps are held in with these little tiny screws. Don't lose them because they are very difficult to replace. There'll be one on the top and one on the bottom. Although sometimes one of them will be missing because someone took it apart at some point in time to oil things and lost one. And the pump just pulls off like that. And this is our air stem. This guides the pump. Some model lanterns not made by Coleman don't have one, and you'll find the pumps tend to be sloppy. But also, this is threaded at the bottom. When you screw down the pump handle, you're screwing this tip down into the check valve, and that seals it so that it can't leak. Now, the check valve on this is down in the bottom here. You won't be able to see it. And don't remove check valves if you don't have a check valve removal tool, because there are ways to do it. I just had a discussion with someone yesterday who found out the hard way, just like I found out the hard way when I first started working on these. There are methods for getting these out without the tool, and you'll find they work until they don't. So we thread this rod into the check valve, and then we take the sleeve. You notice it's got two ears on it. Those lock into the check valve. Just rotate this. There we go. Put the nut on to hold it. And then we just take a crescent wrench. Screw it. Nice and easy. This check valve, all I'm going to do is blow some carburetor cleaner through it just to make sure it's clean. I know it holds pressure. You can hear it rattle. That's the little ball bearing inside that opens and closes to seal it. So we're good to go there. Now, last thing we want to do is take the valve wheel off. We'll take the disc off first. I'm going to put the valve wheel back on in a second. But I want to, this is a 9/16 here. I want to remove the valve stem. This is a packing nut. There's a graphite packing in here. Not in the nut itself, but this is what cinches it down. The packing, you just see some graphite mess coming out here. So put the knob on and we will turn it out. Okay, so it feels like it stops there. Screw back in. easier to turn if the screw is in there holding it in place. There we go. Never been nervous about this before, but just 2 weeks ago, I was contacted by a more or less local viewer who was doing just this on a 220E and twisted and twisted and twisted and ended up snapping the splines off for the knob. So we're still good here. And so I gave him my last 220 valve stem that I didn't think I'd ever need again. So you can see there's a brass ring down here, there's a brass ring here, and then there's this graphite packing in the middle. And that graphite packing is what seals this so that fuel doesn't leak out. This tip screws back into the valve here, and that's your fuel shutoff point. Now, the fun part is getting this valve out. And I want to be careful on this because a 220D has a brass fount, which means it's soft. So if you just put a wrench on here and torque down on it, especially if you have to put it on its side to torque down on it like that, it's really easy to torque it and bend in one side of the fount. It's common on these brass founts that you'll find it's got like one side is bent, or you'll look at the valve and it sits at an angle because part of the fount has been dented in, and that's usually what does it, because someone put a wrench on there. So because this is one of these soft founts, what I'm going to do, and because my experience with American the Colemans made in the Wichita factory in the States is that the thread locker or thread sealant they put on here is really tight, which makes it all the more likely that I could bend the brass fount. I am going to use a 9/16 socket, and I'm going to use my impact gun. So let me get this set up here. So all I have to do is just put that socket on there. And I always remind myself, this is reverse and this is forward. So that tightens it, that loosens it. And I need to hold the fount down, but this is really important. Safety, folks. Don't hold it up here because this thing is going to spin. It's going to spin fast and it's going to spin hard. So make sure that you're holding this down here. You may also want at this point to pay attention to how this is clocked. So if we're looking at it straight on, we've got the pump on the right and the fuel cap on the left. You see how easy that was? If you don't have an impact gun, beg, borrow, or steal one, I don't know. That thing has saved me. I don't use it for much, but it saved me on this, and it saved me on the rear differential on my Acura. That's the only thing I ever use it on. Yeah, that saved more than one fount from being damaged. So now we'll take the bottom part of this valve apart. I think 7/16. Nope. Let's see if it's a 3/8. It is a 3/8. These won't always have a hex on them. It may be a Canadian thing, but most of the ones I find up here, they're just round and you've got to grab it with pliers and turn it off. So that's our fuel valve. And then here's the heart of our easy light system, or instant light system rather, is this air wire and a spring. So this is why these lanterns don't flood. The old quick lights, you had to preheat the generator so that when the fuel hit it, it wouldn't flood all over the place and make a fireball. Coleman came up with this ingenious idea. You've got this fuel and air tube. It's actually a double-walled tube. So there's a little hole here at the top. Sometimes they're crimped together. This has one on either side. Sometimes they can be different depending on when they were made and all that. There's a little tiny hole in the bottom. This is your fuel pickup. And what happens is, when you open the valve a quarter turn, this is up in the valve and the valve stem is up against this. And when the valve is screwed all the way in, it pushes this plunger down. As you back it out, this tapered stem backs out and allows the air wire to lift just ever so slightly. What that does when the air wire is down in the bottom, or when it's pushed down, you can see hopefully you can see that. You can see it poke through the bottom. It almost but not completely blocks the pickup. So when this is held down, a tiny bit of fuel under pressure will seep in around there, but most of what comes out is the air in the top of the fount. So air rushes in here, runs down the outside tube, runs up the inner tube, which leads to the valve, and while it runs up, it picks up that little bit of fuel that's seeping around this wire, just a few droplets, and the air carries it up into the valve, into the generator, and then out, and it ignites. So those droplets are enough to ignite the lantern and create a flame, but not enough for it to flood. So that's why when you light an instant light lantern, you get a bit of a flare-up at first, and then it calms down as the generator warms up and starts vaporizing fuel. At that point, you get back pressure because the fuel expands, you get pressure built up in that generator, and that stops the airflow, at which point then you open the valve further. It says as far as it'll open. That tapered part backs out and allows this air wire to lift up, and it withdraws from that hole, or retreats from that hole, and now you get an unrestricted fuel flow directly up into the valve. So that's Coleman's ingenious design so that you can light a lantern without it flooding, even though you didn't preheat it. So the typical problems with these: this orifice can be caked with varnish or have other crud in there. It may look open, but if it's got a buildup in there, it may be just enough that when the air wire is pushed down, fuel doesn't get around it. You can watch my video on fuel system problems. I'll put a link up here and get more information on solving those sorts of things. The other issue is the spring may be compressed. So before I put these together, I always give them a bit of a stretch just to make sure that they're going to lift properly. So that's everything. I'll have to find out what that is banging around in there. That shouldn't be the case. But this fount is not rusty. I dumped out the fuel. It's old. And it looks like this. There's some sediment down there on the bottom, and it's discolored. But we can filter this and put it back in, and it'll be just fine. No, that's not unleaded. That is Coleman fuel. It's just picked up some local color from the inside of the fount. So our next step is to clean all these parts, and I'm going to do that in a citric acid bath. And because this fount doesn't have it doesn't have a rust problem. I mean, it's not going to rust because this part is brass. The bottom is steel, so it can rust. But if the bottom of the fount was rusty, when I dumped out that gas, there would be a lot of rust in there, not just sediment. There is a little bit of crud in there, and something's banging around, so I need to work on getting that out. But I'm going to put this whole thing in a mild citric acid bath, and that will clean the nickel and get it ready to polish. And then I'll do something similar with all the other parts. So I will see you in the kitchen when we've got that set up. Before we get to the cleaning of the metal parts, let's take care of the globe, and let's take care of the vent. So for these, I'm just going to use Simple Green. Spray it on here. This stuff is great for removing pretty much everything, especially soot that builds up on these. Soft cloth, and then the vent. This is just dusty for the most part. Spray inside. I suspect my friend Allison cleaned this off for me, and then it just got dusty because it took so long to get it to me. Alright, that's good. Take some paint, I can get that off. Let's try that. Welcome to the stovetop. So here is our fount. This is in a mixture of citric acid and water. I use this citric acid powder. It's about $10 per kilogram, which is that's the cheapest way I found to buy it. So I put in about a teaspoon per liter of water. And I will leave the fount in there for about 15 minutes. That will just cut the patina and the crud on it and prep it for polishing. And this will also rinse out the inside. And then next to it, in the small pan, I've got the same citric acid solution, and I've got all the brass pieces in there. And when these are done, I'll take these out and rub them down with steel wool, and then we'll take them to a polishing wheel. Once the fount comes out, then I will put in the other steel pieces and nickel plated pieces, because you want to try to do your best to keep brass and steel separate. So I'll see you in a bit. Here's our fount out of the citric acid bath. It took most of the crud off. I don't know, there's something, you can see where something rubbed on it here. This may polish off. It may be a bad spot in the nickel, it's hard to say. But what we're going to do first is just rinse everything. Shake it. And what I want to do is rinse it out, and there's a little bit of stuff coming out of there, but I think we're in good shape. Make sure there's nothing in there. I want to be able to see what comes out. I want to keep doing this until the water that comes out is clear and there's no sediment or any bits of heat. That stuff will get up into your fuel system and clog it up. I think we're good. So now I need to dry this out. First thing I'm going to do is just take a watered up paper towel or twisted up paper towel and make sure the pump tube is dry. And then another paper towel, twist it up, put it in at the filler cap. Here, there's actually water. I'm going to blow through the pump tube just to get any water out of the snorkel. And I think we're good there. So that should be nice and saturated. Try that again. You're not going to get all the water out. You could heat the fount in the oven, but there's a faster and easier way, I think. So I think we're good there. So what I'm going to do put a funnel in here. And I'm going to pour some methyl hydrate down inside the fount. It doesn't take much. Methyl hydrate is just alcohol. And alcohol absorbs water. Just shake it around. And then I will dump that out. Sometimes the methyl hydrate will actually cut stuff that's in the fount that the citric acid didn't, and you'll pour it out and it'll be blue or green, or this was a little bit yellow. So I will do this again. And our fount is now dry, so except for the outside, but I'll dry that with a towel. Now we'll move on to the other metal parts. All right, here we've got our brass and steel parts. This is the collar, and these just come out of the citric acid. So I'm just going to rinse everything really well to get the acid off, and then I will scrub them down with 4/0 steel wool. It looks pretty black, but it's coming out nice and shiny. Here's our air tube and manifold. This will polish up better on the buffing wheel, but we've got it clean and we've got the tarnish off now. Cast manifolds are kind of hard to get with the steel wool, but you can use a wire reel on those too. Now, this is why you want to get these parts, the burners off and all of that. I'm going to clean this out. I've got these round brushes. You can get these on Amazon or AliExpress or a variety of different places. They're really cheap and work very well. So those are clean. Now the generator. I did heat and quench this, and the asbestos packing and spring came out pretty easily. But citric acid bath should break up all the carbon, and you can see all that carbon coming out. Get rid of that. Also on these 220 generators, see that little brass mesh that came out? This is not necessary anymore. It keeps the tip from clogging, but that's from kind of back in the days when there was a bunch of, when fuel wasn't necessarily as clean as it is now. So you can easily take those out and throw them away. If you leave it in there and try to put the generator back together, chances are your cleaning needle will get hung up on it and bend, and then you'll need a new generator, or at least a new cleaning needle. So that gives you a good idea of what I do with the citric acid and then cleaning up afterwards. If you wanted to, you could just leave it at that. I like to put them on the polishing wheel, and we will do that next when I'm done here. All right, let's polish this fount. It should not take much. Apart from this one spot, everything looks pretty good. So using a cotton buffing wheel and some white polishing compound.
off, I think this will look great. So I'm just going to continue on with this and maybe do a time lapse here. Good. I'll give it a wipe down with some methyl hydrate in a rag just to get that residue off and make sure everything looks okay. But yeah, I think there's some freckles, but that's all right for being 72, 73 years old. We're, I think, looking something in good shape. So we've got all these other parts now. Let's polish them up. Collar does. This is steel. Back. Everything is cleaned and ready to be reassembled. The fountain turned out really nicely. There is a little dark spot in the nickel here, and there's, there are a few little freckles here. But for 73 years old, this is really nice. So let's start with, go the easy way. Start with a fuel cap. All right, got the pump, air stem, our two little itty bitty screws that I managed not to lose, pump leather, these two guys, and the cap and the spring. So cap on first, and then the spring, and the backer. Make sure all these are reasonably tight, because if they fall off in the bottom of the pump tube, it's a real pain. Put our pump leather on, and then this guy sit on there and see if we can get it started this way. There we go. Okay, now we'll put check valve back in. So I'll thread it onto my check valve tool. Slip it down there. Good. Now we need to oil our pump cup. You can use anything that's not a vegetable oil. Anything that's like a vegetable oil will eventually go rancid on here and get sticky and sometimes harden. You just don't want to do that. So Coleman used neat's foot oil originally, and the little tubes they sold of oil for lubricating were neat's foot oil. It's kind of perfect for leather, but I like 3-in-1 oil, just as long as it's not a vegetable-based oil, you're good. Wipe our excess off. And we'll line up the holes. And latex gloves make this difficult, but it wasn't too bad. Right, mount is back together. Now, let's put our valve together. So we've got the lower part of the valve. We've got our fuel and air tube, our air wire, and our spring. So the spring goes, the air wire goes into the spring so that this shoulder here sits on top of it. And then it goes into our cleaned air, or our fuel and air tube. You can see it poking through there. And then this threads into the bottom. And we just snug it up there. Now, when we put this in, remember, we want to clock it, and we've got the 228 here to see. We want this valve projecting out halfway between these two. We want the pump on this side, the fuel cap on that side. This is a tapered brass thread, so theoretically, if you get it in there and you get it tight, it shouldn't leak. But once you take them apart and put them back together, sort of the threads are already a little bit stretched. And if we have trouble getting it clocked the way we want, this Permatex blue thread sealant will make sure that it doesn't leak, just in case. Put my crescent wrench on there, and I think let's see, is that right? I think we may have gone just a little bit too far. I think that's just right. Okay, so we've got the valve on. Let's go ahead and put our valve stem back in. We'll have to push a bit to get that to go in because we had to pull a bit to get it to come out. Okay. All right, that's in, and now our nut, and this will push the packing back in. So, yeah, that's the right one. Now we want this tight enough that the graphite packing seals, but not, that's too tight, but not so tight that we can't turn it. That's still, there we go. And it doesn't feel quite right, so I'm going to back this off and have a look and make sure that the packing actually did seat all the way in there. And it did, so it looks just like when we took it off. So we're good. So we just need, and it's a little on the tight side, but the nut isn't that tight. I don't want it to leak, so I'm going to leave it as it is for now. When it's running, I'll check to make sure there are no leaks here. If it leaks, I'll tighten it up. But sometimes it's just a matter of the first couple times you run it and you get some heat in here, that graphite packing will loosen up. So we didn't get the graphite packing wet, so that's good. It should still be fine. Okay, now collar. That just sits right on there, and you've got a nice little shoulder for that to center on. And the tip cleaner assembly now. And we'll put this on here. Now, we want the tip cleaner, the little cutout for the tip cleaner assembly. We want this to sit on here, and we want this midway, approximately midway between the valve and the fuel cap. This is the hole that this will go through, and then this is the hole for the air tube once it's all put together. Now, again, this also should sit, our collar's slightly out of round. Now that'll fix itself once it's tightened up, but you see how that fits together like that. So what we need to do is just put that on there, and I'm going to put some thread locker on here as well. This, you want to do it very sparingly, because if it happens to run down and get into that valve, that is not good. You can see Coleman had some kind of thread sealant. I keep saying locker, it's a thread sealant. They had something on there. In fact, you can still see, I couldn't quite get all of it off in the cleaning process. We're just gonna thread that on there. We've got it cross-threaded. Oh, that's right. Okay. Now we'll take our 9/16 again. Actually, our 1/2 inch might fit now that it's been polished. Yeah, that'll work. And this is kind of the tricky part. I'm going to tighten this, and hopefully our valve doesn't turn at the same time. But what I'm going for is to turn this. It's all right if all this other stuff moves. We can tighten that up in a bit. But I want this halfway in between there. Halfway in between the valve and the fuel cap. And it's going to be tight, because you remember how tight it was when we put it, or when we took it apart. So let's see how that looks. We put everything together. This upright should be in line with the valve. And if that's the case, then I should be able to look down through the hole for the air tube and see straight down through the hole in the collar. So I think we're good. I think maybe we can go just a little bit more. Because this upright isn't quite where it should be. Now, we'll check again. That's where we want it. And line that up. Yeah, I think that's perfect. So now we'll tighten down this nut, and that will lock everything in place. If you're working on a later one of these, like an E or an F, one thing you'll want, you can use a lid from a sour cream container or something. I just use this piece of cardboard with a notch in it. And once that nut is loose, you can slip this under the collar. That will keep you from messing up the paint on the fount. And I'm going to go all the way around to make sure everything is seated before we tighten this down. I have enough clearance in here for my regular winch, but sometimes that doesn't work out, and if you have trouble with that and you happen to have a mil spec, either a lantern or a stove, the wrench for the mil spec is designed exactly for this, and it will fit perfectly underneath here. Now, you want it tight enough that none of this moves. Not so tight that you end up deforming the bottom of the cage. So we're good. Now, let's put the tip cleaner back together. Before I mess with that, we need to get this notch in, or that actuator into that notch on the eccentric block. If we just put this in here, the eccentric block will drop down. So this is a trick I figured out a long time ago. Take a paper clip, put it through the hole for the generator, or for the cleaning needle hook, and you can just drop that down in there, and that'll hold it in the right place. Now, let's get this guy threaded in. Now, this, again, the paper clip will hold the eccentric block where it needs to be, and hopefully, as we screw this in, since the eccentric block can move freely, usually what happens is, oh, see, we caught it. So the actuator has caught that, and you can see it going up and down. So we just need to tighten this now. And now we can remove our paper clip. That's a handy little trick. So we'll turn that down for now just to protect it. And we've got our burner assembly. We'll set this aside for a moment. We need to put this guy back together. That's a simple matter. Just screw the air tubes in. Again, take our tape covered pliers so we don't make a mess of things. Grab the burner cap and just make sure it's tight. And do the same thing on the other side. You really don't want the tubes or the caps falling off while the lantern's running. It's not the end of the world, but you'll have to take it apart and you'll destroy a mantle, or both your mantles really, in the process. Now we just screw this in, and you see this little hole here. We need to screw that in until it lines up with this hole here. And then we'll put our screw, or set, or I guess it's kind of a set screw. We'll put it back in there. And it should line up about the time it stops turning. So that should be it. And I said earlier that this screw is brass. On this it's steel. So I don't know, maybe that's an American thing. But it is easier to get them out than to get them in. So, and I think we may still... There we go. It just wasn't quite lined up. Maybe I'll try this little screwdriver to get it in there. That's easier. And now we'll tighten it with this guy. Okay. Almost done. Our generator now. Got our jam nut, we've got the generator itself, I've got the little tiny tip, I've got the cleaning needle, and we've got the packing. Now this I'm sure is original to this lantern. This is an asbestos tube, or it's braid. There's a spring inside. So what I did, I had to heat and quench this. It only took one try, one cycle to heat and quench, and it freed this up. It was carboned in there, and you can see it's kind of dirty. This was black and very hard when I pulled it out. The braid was all filled with carbon. So I now will very carefully thread the needle through there so it doesn't mess up the needle there on the end. I heated this, and it's asbestos, so I heated it with my propane torch and quenched it a number of times, and that got it cleaned up. And I'm actually going to put it in the other direction. This lower end is a little bit messy and probably won't want to go in neatly. Needle out a bit. I usually, on other models, I like to put the generator on first, make sure the needle is okay and that I can see it there. Retract it, put the tip on, and do it that way so that I don't accidentally end up crushing the needle inside the tip. But on a 220, and then I put the top of the lantern on. 220 doesn't work that way, because this goes up inside here. 220 is kind of different from everything else. So we'll put our jam nut on. I'll raise the actuator so that our little hook is exposed there. Let me turn this sideways, maybe you can see better. And I will stick that up in that hole and hook the cleaning needle on there and rotate it down so it stays in place. Put the jam nut on. And 7/16. And then we'll just make sure that that is nice and tight. Okay, last thing is our valve wheel. sure the valve is closed, and then orient the direction disc properly. Back it off just a bit. And there we go. So we're almost done. While we've got it open, I'm going to put some mantles on. These are Peerless 2CHGs. They're designed for a double mantle lantern or lamp. I think these are the new ones. These aren't the greatest quality. I'm not super happy with them, but they're better quality than the current Coleman number 21s, which would be the sort of the by the book or the factory option for these. So I pre-tie the first loop, cinch it up a little bit, put it on, cinch it up the rest of the way. You want the tie sitting under that ridge, and I'll try to redistribute the gathering here a bit. You always want the flat part of the mantle facing the generator. Scissors falling on the floor. And always cut your string ties off so they don't curl down and poke a hole in the mantle, which seems to happen inevitably if you don't. You can tell the older Peerless mantles, even the ones that were made in the Philippines just a few years ago, because they've got a Peerless P on the side of them. In fact, it remains even after you burn them. These do not have that. Again, this is easier without gloves. All right. Put our globe on and our vent. So this little spot here, I always kind of find these fascinating. This little spot here I thought was some white paint that was on there, but it's actually a little spot of white enamel, and these are enameled black on the inside, but the 228s are white underneath. And sometimes like this, you see a little spot of white enamel got into the green, and I assume they're doing all these vents at the same time, and this got some white on it. So I don't know, I find that kind of neat. So here we go. Through the magic of video editing, I will go away momentarily, and when I come back, these mantles will be burned in, and I will have fuel in here, and we'll be ready to light it up. Right. The mantles are burned in. We've got gas in here. By the way, I've simply filtered and put back in the gas that was in here. I let it sit in a Pyrex measuring cup for most of the day, and all of the sediment that was in there from the fount settled to the bottom. I had nice clear Coleman fuel or naphtha, whatever brand it was, on the top, and I filtered that through a filter funnel as I poured it in. So it should be fine. That gas could be decades old. I don't know. Kind of a testament to the fact that naphtha or Coleman fuel lasts forever. After the apocalypse, there will be Coleman fuel and there will be cockroaches. I've fired up lanterns and stoves with gas that I knew was 50, 60 years old, and no problems. You can't do that with pump gas, but Coleman fuel, yes. So, got a match here. First, we'll pump it up to about 25 pumps. Now, I'm going to open the valve. Normally I wouldn't worry too much about this, but because the whole system has been apart and cleaned and it's dry, I'm going to open a quarter turn, and then I'm going to listen for a spitting sound. That spitting sound is when I open it a quarter turn, that air stem, or the air wire rather, is pushed down and blocking the fuel pickup. So a little bit of fuel leaks by. The air going in through the top of the fuel and air tube runs down, back up, picks up that little bit of fuel and brings droplets up to the generator, and that's what it will use to ignite and then heat the generator. So I want to listen. I'll hear a hiss, but I want to listen for those droplets. Sometimes it takes a while if the lantern is dry. Sometimes it doesn't. I don't know why. Some of them just seems to get, the fuel seems to get there more quickly. So I'm going to crack it open and listen for that sputtering sound. Oh, and we've got the sputtering sound immediately, so that's good. Blow out any fumes, light my match. Oh. And I didn't even have to mess with the cleaning lever, although I might here in a minute. Let's see, there it's going. So I'm going to open up all the way. I would have hoped it would be brighter than that, so this might be a time for the cleaning lever. Or this just may be those new Peerless mantles. The last thing I put them on, I wasn't really impressed with the brightness. There we go, that's better. They're not as white as the silk lights are, but that's actually putting out some good light now. So that lit up on a first light up. That went much easier than I would normally have anticipated. Let me cut the lights here. I like that. There's nothing like an old 220 or 228 double mantle. See you next time.